Miss Tiffany, let me know when we're ready to start. Thank you.
Andrea, we're ready.
Okay. Es liosem chaneabo, o mawayaim, hiapsi pavet sivo, simin wayaim. Very good morning here from the Sonora Desert in Arizona. And good evening, good afternoon, good night to everyone. And thank you again for joining on our third day of the um, formal third meeting of the Facilitative Working Group for the Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We've had very productive discussions so far with a great amount of work and thinking and consideration shared by our members as well as the participants. And I'm very appreciative and impressed by everybody's work. Um, I'm not sure if my co-chair Yo would like to say anything to start the meeting today. I'm the way we divided it is I'm going to chair the discussion of activity 10, the first item on our agenda. Then Yo is going to do activity 11, and then after that we're going to be breaking into two groups to discuss our breakout theme, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Yo, do you want to say any opening words?
Not really, Andrea, except to say hello to everyone and ditto, echoing everything you've said already. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Um, and again, we're dealing with three different formats for input. If those that are not members of the Facilitative Working Group can close off your camera, it will help me to be able to see hands raised on screen from the members of the Facilitative Working Group. We will also be with the assistance of the Secretariat, who I want to express my profound appreciation to for all of their help. We have a hand raised feature on the participants icon, and then we also have a chat room, and participants outside of the working group members have been indicating their wish to speak as well. And just to remind everybody, we're going to be preserving the comments in the chat room, which include very instructive input from the participants, resources and links that relate to the discussion that we've been having. So we'll all get a copy of the chat room. So if you have just a comment, if you don't want to take the floor, you have a comment or some information to share or a link to an important document that pertains to the discussion, please put it on the chat room, and that will all be preserved by the Secretariat for the members for our future work. So thank you again, everybody. And without delay, I want to begin the discussion on activity 10. This is still in draft form, as I understand it, so it's not posted on the website. In fact, even yesterday, there was some discussion among the leads. But I do want to say just briefly that I do very much appreciate the work that was done. We've been talking about the need to, without further delay, develop at least the beginnings of our rights framework, our framework for knowledge sharing, our safeguards for all the discussions that we've been having so far. That's been something that has not been advanced largely because we weren't able to begin these discussions at the regional gatherings as we intended to. But there's a lot of action items and work taking place that really would benefit from this development. So Estebancio and I on the first day agreed that we would begin work pulling in everything everybody's done so far, based on the stated deliverables for activity 2, the regional gatherings. But there were important rights safeguards raised in both the concept note and then the report on the input, including right to self-determination, participation, not engagement, but actually the use of the term participation, which is part of the explanation of this activity, talking about the equal standing of Indigenous peoples' knowledge systems, land and treaty rights, and other important elements of a rights framework for the work of this body and the discussion on Indigenous peoples and climate change. ILO and the ILO 169 and the UN Declaration were also cited as standards that would provide a basis for this discussion. So with that, I would like to turn over the floor to Alec, who is on my list as the co-lead who will be presenting this work, and then open the floor to the other co-leads and then the members of the Facilitative Working Group and then the participants. Thank you. Alec, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and greetings from Lusaka. It's this afternoon here. So, Chair and colleagues, Activity 10 is about good practices for Indigenous peoples and local communities' participation in national climate policy. I'm sure that the Chair will be happy with the term of participation as opposed to engagement, which appeared in the previous activity, which was Activity 9. So colleagues, the activity calls for parties, Indigenous peoples, local communities, and others to report annually through submissions on the implementation of good practices for Indigenous peoples and local communities' participation in national climate policy. And as you heard from the Chair, the concept note is still being worked on. It hasn't been finalized yet. So this activity falls under LCIPP's function of climate change policies and actions, whereby the platform facilitates the integration of diverse knowledge systems, practices, and innovations in designing and implementing international and national actions, programs, and policies in a manner that respects and promotes the rights and interests of local communities and indigenous peoples, and the undertaking of stronger and more ambitious climate action by Indigenous peoples and local communities that could contribute to the achievement of the NDCs of the parties concerned. So the activity basically has three objectives. The first objective is to collect annual reports from parties, Indigenous peoples, local communities, and others with information on the topic of the implementation of good practices for Indigenous peoples and local communities' participation in national climate policy. That's the first objective. Then the second objective is once this information is collected, then it's synthesized or summarized into one document. And then the third activity is finally to organize an in-session dialogue to discuss the summary and information received. So once all this information is put together, then an in-session dialogue will be organized where all this information will be discussed. So in terms of approach, we have two calls for submission. So each year we'll have one call that will be open to all. And then after receiving this information, a summary document will be compiled, comprising of all the submissions. And then, as I said, an in-session dialogue will be organized. So in terms of the timelines, Activity 10 is mandated for FWG 3, which is this session, and FWG 5. And these years are 2020 and 2021 respectively. So, Chair, in terms of progress, in terms of where we are so far, as I indicated and as you stated in your opening remarks, the concept note is yet to be finalized, but it's under preparation right now. So what has been done so far is that a call for submission was launched, and submissions were received from OASIS, the EU, Canada, ILO, the Native Women's Association of Canada, the Climate Heritage Network, and Tuvalu Climate Action Network. Once I'm done, I'll ask Jeremy from the Secretariat to just give a short presentation regarding the summary of these submissions. So now, after these submissions, Chair, where do we go? So the next steps are which we are proposing as follows. Since the activity mentions that parties, Indigenous peoples, local communities, and others should report annually, we are proposing, Chair, to extend the call for submissions up to March next year, March 21, and encourage more people to submit these good practices. Then again, the draft summary document will be revised, incorporating now these new submissions to the already those who've already received. So basically, after we extend, we'll continue receiving new submissions, and then the summary document will be updated to include the new submissions. And then finally, we'll have one in-session dialogue, which we plan to hold in conjunction with the session next year. So at this point, I'll ask Jeremy, I don't know if he's ready, to just give us a quick summary of the submissions that we've received so far based on the first call that we had. Jeremy?
Hi, Alec. Yeah, I'm ready.
Jeremy, you have the floor.
Thank you. Okay, can you all see my screen? Wonderful. Okay, so thank you very much, Alec. I'll give a very brief run through the summary paper. So the scope of it, as we've already heard, is to collect a summary of views by parties, Indigenous peoples, local communities, and others on the implementation of good practices for Indigenous peoples and local communities' participation in national climate policy. Sorry. Alec has already taken us through the response. Oh, hold on. I can start a slideshow. There we go. Alec has already taken us through the responses, but we had 2 from groups of parties so far, from AOSIS in the EU, 1 from a party Canada, 1 from an Indigenous peoples organization, the Native Women's Association of Canada, 1 from a UN agency, the ILO, and 3 from other organizations. That's 2 from the Climate Heritage Network and 1 from the Tuvalu Climate Action Network. So the points under these submissions fell into 6 broad categories. These are what they're grouped under right now. If these by your own assessment need to be changed, need to be revised in any way, let us know in this session, or let us know by email over the next 2 weeks, and we'll do that. But those 6 headings were a consideration of local communities and Indigenous peoples in national policy frameworks, participation of local communities and Indigenous peoples in national policy making, so on a policy by policy basis, the rights of Indigenous peoples and self-determination, engagement between Indigenous and government parliaments, Indigenous peoples and government parliaments, 5, gender considerations, and 6, considering and engaging with different methods of different ways of knowing knowledge systems and practices. So those are the 6. As I said, if any of these need revising, changing by your own assessments, let us know by email over the next 2 weeks, or let us know in the session now. Thanks very much. I'll hand back.
So thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I noticed that since this is in draft form and has not yet been approved by consensus of the Facilitative Working Group, that you're calling for input by October 23rd from the FWG members with any comments, suggestions, proposed changes. Is that still correct? So I do encourage everybody to read this carefully. I think it's a very important activity because it does highlight things that we've been talking about, the need to develop the concept of good practices, but what constitutes good practices? That relates back to our rights framework, our safeguards, etc. So this really interlinks with a lot of the things we've been talking about. So by the 23rd of October, please submit any comments, suggestions, etc. And then I assume that we'll be approving this by email or at our next meeting. Tiffany?
Thanks a lot, Andrea. So we're going to extend the call for submissions so that we hopefully get a lot more than what we've already received. Maybe after this discussion, more contributors would also like to submit, parties, Indigenous peoples, or other representatives. And then what we'll do is we'll revise the paper so that we have one compiled paper in the end, and then that'll be for your consideration and finalization at the 5th meeting.
The 5th meeting.
Okay. But at this point, we'll revise what we have. But as more submissions come in, we'll integrate those. So it'll be a bit of a work in progress, the 5th meeting.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments from members? Raise your hand. Just raise your hand on your screen if you'd like to say anything. Daily.
Yeah, thank you for the information about the extension of time. You know, it occurs to me that often the various different UN agencies, as well as parties to a large extent, have greater resources and capacity to respond to this overwhelming number of documents, not just related to the UNFCCC, but across the board. And I guess for me, it raises the point that, for example, you have UN agencies, organs, specialized agencies, and other intergovernmental organizations that are providing input. One example is the ILO. As Jeremy has just indicated, that they've gotten some feedback from them. And I don't know, it seems that I'm not suggesting kind of a screening of these activities, but it seems to me that it's important, and maybe it's the task of the FWG to be hyper-vigilant watchdogs about this, because, for example, the ILO, they themselves are beginning to reinterpret the language of ILO Convention number 169 in a way that's not quite consistent with the understanding of Indigenous peoples. And I'll give you the example of how the ILO is now interpreting consultation and consent, which is a critical issue for Indigenous peoples. And the other day, I think it was the first day, I can't remember now, but I made the reference to the linkages between the ILO Convention number 169 and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the ILO's own understanding that the UN Declaration is complementary and mutually reinforcing to the understanding of the provisions of ILO Convention number 169. And so when you look at these issues, it's really important that the context be understood. And from an Indigenous perspective, from the objects and the subjects of these instruments. And I guess that's a preface to my broader comment about the FWG members, and maybe in a closed meeting or something, at least have a really thoroughgoing discussion about the linkage that has been made between Indigenous peoples and local communities. And I'm not suggesting that we attempt to resolve it in the context of this activity or the next activity. And the next activity is even more important when we begin to talk about funding opportunities and availability of funding for Indigenous peoples versus local communities. To me, that we're really getting into or starting to walk on pretty thin ice from my point of view. So I think that at some point in time, we are going to have again, a thoroughgoing discussion about the treatment of these issues. And I say this primarily because many of us that are engaged in the Facilitative Working Group have had a direct role in putting in place the cultural context that emerged as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I myself was involved in the 2-year revision process of the ILO Convention number 169. And I understand the significance of it in the context of international human rights law. And if we begin to see dramatically different interpretations of this material, and more importantly, the interpretation of our rights as we articulated them in the context of these human rights standard setting exercises, then we're going to run into significant problems. And they saturate everything. It's not just a matter of a discrete activity, 1, 2, 3, etc., but it saturates everything. So I'm just proposing that at some point in time, we figure out a way to resolve the issue of the existence of Indigenous human rights in a number of instruments, but more significantly also recognize that there is a wealth of information at the national and domestic level that points to the significant distinction between Indigenous peoples and local communities. And it pivots upon the distinct pre-existing or inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. So I don't want to get into a longer discussion here. I've already taken up too much time, but this is an important example, especially when we talk about climate change at the national and domestic level, or at the international level, as we just did in Activity 9 yesterday. How we tackle it, I'm uncertain, but it does need a much more in-depth and comprehensive discussion, and in my view, should attach itself, in terms of our understanding of it, attach itself to all of our work and all of our activities. So again, sorry to be long-winded about it, but I am deeply concerned about the issue. And as some of you may recall, even as long ago as the very generous invitation of the government of Canada for Indigenous peoples to come together to talk about how the platform should be set up or stood up. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. It's important that we maintain in our writing and our work, our discussions, but also our interactions with the UNFCCC and other UN bodies, that Indigenous peoples and local communities are two distinct constituencies. And too often, because of the terminology, they're lumped together, and we have to be vigilant about that. I agree. I have Estebancio and then Irina. You had your hand up? Okay. And again, we are pressed for time on all these discussions, unfortunately. Go ahead, Estebancio.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to be very brief since I think that they elaborate a lot, and I think that I support. First of all, I would like to support her proposal. I think it is important, if not only for us as a Facilitative Working Group members, but also for the parties themselves. I have had opportunity to have a conversation with some parties, and they are having difficulties to identify how are they gonna work with the local communities, since some of them, they don't have that recognition in their countries. So I think that we really need, it is why, for this reason, I think it is important to go in depth discussion among us and close meeting with the Facilitated Working Group member. So that's what I would like to support the proposal made by Daly. And of course, the comment also made by yourselves, Madam Co-Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Irina had her hand up.
Actually, Andrea, no. But
Oh.
since I have the opportunity to talk, I think it's very important what Dilly has brought to the table. And yes, I echo the concern just expressed by Estebancio about the limitations that we have had about the local communities representation in this platform. And on behalf of the governments which I represent, I would like to keep talking with about this situation and try not to let them behind, since they don't have any representation, formal representation to the UN, and as well mentioned by Estebancio, even in the local level, they don't have sometimes organizations to represent them. That's it. Thank you very much, Andrea, for the opportunity.
Thank you. I have a hand raised from Rodian and then Yo.
Thank you, Andrea. And first, I would like to apologize for my missing yesterday meeting because of my travel to my native region, and it's now midnight, and hello from my native land. I have one clarification and also a short observation. From my point, this activity, it's very critical for us to be engaged very actively into the national climate policy, because we had a lot of progress at the global negotiations, but the weakest point for us, it's domestic and the community level. And I believe this kind of activity is the best mechanism and a way how we should increase voice of communities and indigenous peoples in terms of fully participation under the national climate negotiation. And I would encourage to all members just to provide more good and best practices how indigenous peoples and local communities could be engaged and to be champions, because I think that is a critical point in terms of having this weak point. This is a paradox, because all decisions are made by the capitals, but all impacts are taking place at the local and community level. So we should overcome this kind of gaps and dots, and to bring more good practices. And finally, is a good example from my region. You know that Russia joined the Paris Agreement only recently, last years, and Russia also has approved a new federal adaptation plan with regard to the climate change. And so far, we jointly with Russian scientists are trying to develop local adaptation strategy, focusing on integration of science and traditional knowledge. And I think from our contribution, this is the best way how we can push and also to be a champion at our national campaign in order to be fully engaged and influence to the national climate policy. Thank you.
Thank you. And then my last speaker on the list is Yo. There's some questions and answers going on in the chat, but no one asking for the floor. And we are also at the end time. And then at the end, I will summarize the recommendations for next steps. Thank you. Yo.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Just wanted to briefly take the floor and echo the comments already made about the importance of this particular group having a full discussion as soon as possible about the distinctions between Indigenous peoples and local communities in the context of our group, as well as in the context of interactions with entities and outside of the group. And I will note that in the AOSIS submission for activity 10, we did highlight the importance of parties honoring the rights-based approach recognized by the Paris Agreement, particularly with respect to their obligations toward the rights of Indigenous peoples when taking climate action. So we made that distinction between Indigenous peoples and local communities, just highlighting the rights-based approach as applied to Indigenous peoples. And since there's going to be an extension of the deadline, we might flesh out that point in a future updated submission. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Pasang, and to keep within the schedule, I think this is the last speaker on this item, and then I'll turn the floor over to my co-chair for facilitating the discussion on activity 11.
Thank you, Andrea, and good evening, everyone. Maybe good morning, some of you there. I would like to just echo what earlier our friends have, highlighted the critical topics for all of us. This topic I have been always sharing in the past also how important it is to have the negotiation or recognition of Indigenous peoples' values and concept and experiences and knowledge dealing with the climate change at the national level. We all are aware that the global level, at least, we have started kind of discourse, but this discourse is yet to be reflected at the national level. And also I highlighted yesterday that the national relevant policies, including the NAPs and the NDCs, almost all are based on the secondary data at the country level. So that is also a worrying part, like bypassing the Indigenous people's engagements or Indigenous people full and meaningful participation and providing our concerns. So in the context of Nepal now, we are in the and the new constitution of Nepal, new constitution of Nepal has a provision of like a federal and provincial and the local levels developing the new laws. And there are possibilities, chances of recognition of Indigenous people customary institution, our governance system, to protect our knowledge and values and experiences to be recognized by the local laws in relation to the conservation or management or natural resources. But that part is kind of missing in the climate change discourse, because most of the research and most of the policies more based on the secondary data, and the engagement of Indigenous peoples is the possible of putting on the side. So I think on this one, because when you talk about the best practices, I think this activity 10 need to highlight that the gaps and challenges we have been facing at the national level. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Pasang, and thank you, everyone. And I remind you that by October 23rd, the FWG members should submit their additional comments to the co-leads, who I believe are Alec and Eli. Is that correct on this item? Thank you. And you can also submit through the secretariat so that everybody can see your feedback. Just in terms of next steps, there's some good dialogue going on in the chat, and I thank you, Tiffany, for responding to some of the questions about how we're going to continue disseminating and achieving wider dissemination of the call for inputs on this very important item. We all agree. We'll work on some of the text for a possible framework for the criteria for what are good practices, which we don't have now at all. And also very important, it's been called for a closed discussion on the issue of local communities as a constituency vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples as a constituency. I want to remind you that the COP resolution to create this body made that distinction very clearly, as well as uplifted the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we do have a basis for that. Oh, there's Pasan's little girl. Hello. So I just want to say that if the Secretariat could put out some possible dates for that, reminding you we're supposed to also include this issue of how we plan to deal with this based on the technical working group we had last year at the Substa on local communities and Indigenous peoples in this context, as well as other discussions and feedback that we've gotten on this matter. We're supposed to include that in our report next and recommendations on that matter. So if the Secretariat could maybe circulate what they call, Google Doc or whatever the calendar is, to see when we could have that discussion. It clearly needs more attention, and several members have flagged that. So with that, I thank everybody for their input, and thank Tiffany for answering some of the answers. Oh, also, I'm reminded to note that there was a response from the report from the technical working group on local communities that we had last year from the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, aka the Indigenous Caucus, actually challenging some of the report. And maybe we could submit that again to the Secretariat before our closed meeting so that people can read those responses as well and take them into account for our discussion. So thank you very much. Tiffany?
Hi,
Yes.
Andrea.
Hi.
On that report, there was one change which was suggested to Tosi, who was the author of that report, and that was revised.
Okay.
And the other points in the letter from the caucus were, I would say, discussing the points that had been made in the workshop, not specifically the report. The report is a summary of the workshop, and it has to summarize what was said. But it's kind of responding to some of the things people said in that workshop. So just to clarify that.
Well, it would be good. I appreciate it if you could recirculate the revised report based on the input from the caucus, as well as the caucus letter before we have the discussion on this matter, just to remind everybody where we're at with it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, and then give us some choices of dates and times. It would be good to have this discussion as soon as we can, definitely before our next meeting. So with that, thank you, everybody, and thank you to the co-leads for this important work that's been done so far. Very key to our overall area of work and assignment for this body. And I turn the chair over to my co-chair, Yo, to conduct the discussion of activity 11.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and greetings again to everyone. So moving to activity 11, as noted in the agenda, excuse me. So activity 11 is a mapping and reporting on existing funding within the UN system and identifying additional funding opportunities for participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities from all regions related to climate change. The co-leads for this particular activity are Rodion and Irina. My understanding is that the concept note for this activity is online, and also a zero draft synthesis document, a pretty extensive one, has been circulated to FWG members, and it's open for comment up until I think the 23rd of this month. But in any case, my understanding is that Irina will be the co-lead giving the update on this activity. So please go ahead, Irina.
Thank you, Joe, and greetings to everybody. Before beginning, I would like to recognize the work done by my colleague Rodion, who has been working in this subject from the beginning alongside with Elvira. And for me, it has been very, very easy to take the work they have been developing and continuing with this work. I would like to restate what Joe has already mentioned. Activity 11 of the platform initial 2-year work plan aims to map and report on existing funding within the United Nations system and identify additional funding opportunities for the participation of Indigenous people and local communities from all regions related to climate change. The main objective of this activity, as per the work plan, is to identify existing funding within the UN system that is related to climate change, including those that are part of the financial mechanism of the convention and others, as well as to identify additional funding opportunities for the participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities from all regions related to climate change. This activity also aims to map funds and at least different levels that are accessible to Indigenous peoples related to capacity building and education, adaptation, and mitigation. To that end, the activity has 2 mandates deliverables. The first mandate deliverable is the synthesis document, and the second mandate is an online tool. About the first mandate, about the first mandate, with the support of the Secretariat, we have surveyed relevant UN entities, including climate financial mechanism of the convention and others. We have also interviewed key actors in order to identify existing funds and fundings opportunities for Indigenous peoples and local communities' participation in climate change related activities. And we are happy to report that we have a zero draft of the synthesis document that has been sent to the members of the FWG. For the review and commenting, as Joe has already mentioned, the deadline for this is 23rd of October. About the second mandate, which is to elaborate an online tool specifically on funding, which will be housed on the LCIPP dedicated web portal. And since the landscape on the funding opportunities evolves over time, and the synthesis documents only provide a snapshot of the current state of the different funding among these institutions, the online tool with the timely and consistent updates will reflect the changing landscape of funding opportunities for participation of indigenous peoples and local communities related to climate change. It also will raise awareness and ultimately will enhance the engagement of Indigenous people and local communities in the UNFCCC process, which is part of the overall purpose of the platform. We are also happy to report that we have a draft proposal of what content may be most useful to the capture in the online tool. I would like also to underscore that even though we have had this situation, unprecedented situation about the pandemic of COVID-19, we have been very lucky, and we could continue working in order to the timeline is not affected for the implementation of this activity. We are on the schedule to deliver on the 2 mandates that I have already told you. About the next steps, we will finalize the draft synthesis document intersessionally and have it ready for your consideration for the next meeting. We will also operationalize the online tool by the end of 2020. In the effort to deliver this products on time, we invite the members of the FWG, to do two things. Send us the comments on the draft synthesis document and share with us your views about the information and resources you consider most useful to be captured and disseminated to the online tool. In closing, Rodion and I want to thank the relevant entities who has taken part in the platform survey and the interviews for the activity. We will be reaching out to many of you again intersessionally, and we thank you for your continued support to the platform work. Together, we will create a clear map of existing funding opportunities for the participation of Indigenous people and local communities from all the regions related to climate change and enhance their engagement to UNFCCC process. With that, I would like to invite Chad from the Secretariat to enlighten us with a presentation that will show you how we conducted this methodology that I have already told you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina. Please go ahead, Chad.
Thank you. That means yes. Thank you, co-chair. Thank you, Madam Co-lead. Hello, everyone. Adequate funding for the implementation of the three functions of the local communities and the Indigenous Peoples Platform is a part of the guiding principle of the LCIPP, as stated in COP23 decision. The members of the FWG have dedicated this activity, Activity 11, as the part of the initial 3-year work plan of the LCIPP to map and report on existing funding within the UN system and identify additional funding opportunities for the participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities from all regions related to climate change. To that end, with close guidance from the co-leads and the former co-chairs, we have surveyed and interviewed relevant UN entities and others. We have received 31 survey responses, and here's a graph showing that 14 organizations indicated existing funding opportunities for Indigenous peoples and 11 for local communities. It is worth noting that these numbers show in the graph only indicate organizations with existing funding opportunities for Indigenous peoples and the local communities in the context of climate change. This does not, however, mean that other entities do not provide support to Indigenous peoples and the local communities in general. In accordance with the work plan, as well as the co-leads and the concept note, we've also looked at the geographic distribution of such funding opportunities. For the Indigenous peoples, we looked at the 7 sociocultural regions, and for the local communities, we looked at the 5 UN regions in terms of geographic distribution of such existing funding opportunities. We've also looked at the thematic distribution of such existing funding opportunities, and as you can see on the screen, that there seems a higher concentration of funding opportunities in the thematic areas of exchange of experiences, best practices, gender and climate for Indigenous peoples, and for local communities, youth engagement, and the capacity building. Activity 11 also looks at the funding opportunities, existing funding opportunities at different levels, at local, national, regional, and international levels. The co-leads, through their concept note, have highlighted the need to obtain a clear understanding of the extent to which these existing funding opportunities are accessible to Indigenous peoples and the local communities. To that end, the survey, as well as the interviews, subsequent interviews, aims to shed some light on the possible ways that Indigenous peoples and local communities can access these existing funding opportunities. The funds and the organizations often work with and provide financial support through a network of partners. These partners are often known as the agencies. In the case of the Global Environment Facility, the GEF agencies, 18 of them, accredited entities in the case of the Green Climate Fund, and the implementing entities in the case of Adaptation Fund. These entities, they often work with diverse stakeholders at the program and project levels. At the national level, the countries also have nationally designated authority or focal point that often that serve as the interface between each country and the funds. These entities, these designated authorities, they review and approve programs and projects within their respective countries. So the question is, what are some of the possible ways that indigenous peoples and local communities can access these existing opportunities? Here we list 3. 1, to pursue partnership with existing agencies and accredited entities. Second, to get accredited. Of course, the accreditation process are often rigorous and involve multi-stage process and requires the meeting of eligibility criteria. How can indigenous peoples in the local communities learn more about these existing funding opportunities and also the ways to access these existing funding opportunities? Here we list 3. Participation in relevant proceedings. For example, the GEF Council meeting, the 61st GEF Council meeting is coming up later this year. Also the meetings of the GCF and the AF board meetings, as well as also participating in relevant events, including the GCF structured dialogue, the GEF national dialogue, the GEF extended constituency workshops. Also taking advantage of the capacity building opportunities that exist. I list 2 examples here. The Adaptation Fund has e-learning program, and the GEF has GEF Academy, which also provide online course on the operation of the GEF, as well as existing funding opportunities. To further facilitate the indigenous people's understanding of existing funding opportunities and also to access these the funding opportunities, most of the entities that we've surveyed, we've seen some common thread, which is listed here. First, most of them have safeguard policies, including indigenous people's policy. They have indigenous people's advisory groups and steering committee, for example, GEF, EFAT. GCF is also looking to establish an advisory group in accordance to their indigenous people's policy. They also have program specialists and the focal point to help facilitate indigenous people's understanding and access of such existing funding opportunities. As the co-leads mentioned, the landscape of funding opportunities evolves over time. Therefore, this synthesis document only provides a snapshot of the current state. Therefore, Activity 11 also have a second mandated activity deliverable, which is an online tool. Here are some of the potential the content for that online tool. The online tool will be housed under the LCIPP web portal, which my colleague David presented on Monday. These potential content include webinars to hear from the relevant entities, what type of existing funding opportunities that they are providing and how indigenous peoples, local communities can access that. Second, to case studies, to feature good examples where indigenous peoples and local communities have been able to successfully access the existing funding and to benefit from such funding. Third, policies and planning document. Not only just the existence of such policy in the planning document, but also the implementation of such policies and also the designated advisory groups and program specialists. Of course, we will seek the program specialists and focal points written consent if we were to disseminate their information related to them and their contact. And other resources, as I mentioned earlier, and the e-learning opportunities and other training sessions. So what's next? As the co-leads mentioned, next we will continue this effort to finalize the synthesis document and to operationalize the online tool, which is the second mandated deliverable of this activity. To do that, on behalf of the co-leads, FMA, we invite the FWG members to send us your comments on the draft synthesis document and to share with us your views as what information would be most helpful to continue to identify existing funding opportunities and also to access these funding opportunities. We also encourage participants who are tuning in remotely to share with us via the chat function here or send us an email to lcipp@unfccc.int to share with us any additional funding opportunities that you may be aware of that's relevant to this activity. Together with the FWG members' guidance and collaborations, we believe that the deliverable of these activities will provide a clear map of the evolving landscape of existing funding opportunities and to contribute towards the upholding the principles of the LCIPP and the securing adequate funding for the implementation of the three functions of the LCIPP, which are knowledge, capacity building for exchange, and the climate change policies and actions. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention, and I yield the screen back to the co-chair.
Thank you very much, Chad. Do the co-leads have any additional comments to make before we open up the floor? Irina, do you have any additional comments?
I would like to, thank you, Yao. I would like to give the floor to Rodion if he has any comment.
Go ahead, thank you.
Yes, thank you. And first of all, I would like to thank my colleagues Elvira and Irina, and also Chad and also Secretariat for the very strong cooperation and coordination under this specific activity 11, because it's so critical to provide more opportunity in terms of funding to indigenous peoples and local communities. That is absolutely no doubt. And thanks also Chad for the very solid and detailed information and mapping how we are working and what is the next step. And also I think it's at this stage for us as a colleagues will be so critical to have other members' feedback and input and contribution. But at this stage, I strongly believe we could also already recommend that that the mapping and reporting on existing funding related to climate change should continue in the second 3 years work plan. And also we need with support of the Secretariat to convene different webinars to first engage key entities who have contributed to activity 11. And another recommendation is also to invite all relevant entities to disseminate information, including call for proposal and project templates and relevant events to the LCIP web portal. And also engage representative of Facilitative Working Group in relevant events and proceeding of the fund and agencies. It should be very collective joint efforts in order to fulfill activity number 11. Thank
you.
Thank you, Yao. That's on our behalf.
Great. Thank you very much, Irina and Rodion, as well as the Secretariat for that for the presentation. I'd like to open up the floor to a group discussion. Before I do that, though, may I request the Secretariat to circulate the slides that you just presented, as well as all the slides that have been presented in this meeting so far. I realize that they're mostly summaries of documents we already have, but I think it's useful to have these slides as snapshots. And I think in this particular presentation, there's a slide on possible elements for inclusion in the online tool that I don't think we've received in any other form so far. So please circulate that when possible. And opening up to the FWG members, noting please the two questions, excuse me, the two questions or requests from the co-leads on feedback on the draft synthesis document, as well as on possible elements for the online tool, as well as taking note of what Rodion just said about perhaps the importance of continuing this mapping exercise into the next work plan. So opening up the floor to FWG members, I see Andrea. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, and thank our colleagues for this and the Secretariat for this very impressive body of work that this draft contains. I would like to request or suggest just a couple of things. One is that we note the new decision, a fairly new decision from the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council to expand the funding for Indigenous peoples of the UN Voluntary Fund to include climate change activities. I think it's important to alert Indigenous peoples to that opportunity. Second of all, I request for you to include a note for all of these different opportunities, of which are open to Indigenous peoples from all regions and which are restricted to what they call the developing regions, which eliminates the possibility for many of us and our peoples to access these fundings. Also, which are available directly to Indigenous peoples in the spirit of self-determination to receive funding, and which, like the Green Climate Fund, goes through states. I think these are important rights-based concerns, to flag for these. And I will just note that the readiness program funding provides readiness for programs that many Indigenous peoples find problematic, including REDS, carbon market exchange activities, etc. And just take note of that. But anyway, the others are concrete suggestions to add to the document. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrea. And I do note a comment in the chat referencing the UN General Assembly resolution from December of last year with the relevant language on expanding the mandate of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous peoples. So next I have Hindu. Please go ahead, followed by, I think, Pasang. Go ahead, Hindu.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for the presentations of this activity 11. I mean, when I see that the most focus is on funding, and of course, we also mapping the funding in the activity 6. So when I saw just the titles, there is trust, inclusiveness, and resilience. And when I see those three, it is not only the funding who can ensure the inclusiveness or ensure the trust or ensure the resilience. So for me, I think one part is missing. We need to see how just the participation also without the funding can be trusted, can be equitable. The resilience is at the local level and at the national level. And there is behind like adaptation and mitigations. So if we link it with all what is happening in the UNFCCC, we have the NAPS and we have the NAPA, we have also the NDCs. So then those one are always build it or design it at the national level. And this is where the countries can plan them resilience. And I believe that this is where we can request the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples to the designing of those programs at the national level, in order when they are implemented, it can build the resilience of our communities. And our communities also can participate with our knowledge and expertise to help them rebuild a better documents that can ensure the resilience of all the rest of the citizens of the countries. So I think I have the feeling that this part is missing. So if in any way you can include this part of how we can have this participation beyond just like having the funding of Green Climate Fund, or I don't know, the voluntary fund to attend the meetings. Attending the meetings, it's a good way, but we have that in the activity 6. But attending at the regional workshop, I give you the example, like NAPS have a regional workshop based on languages. They have French speaker who can meet at the regional level and discuss and design and get the capacity on how they can redesign them NAPS documents. And a Spanish speaker the same, English speaker the same. So it's really adapt to the countries. And in those spaces, there are lack of participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. So we can request those kind of space in order to have a trusted space and in order to input when they wanted to design from the beginning, and at the national level, as I said earlier. And then at the local level, there are also a localized implementation of the climate policy that we are taking at the international or at the national level. And then those places, I think, will be the most important for me to be in this part of the activity 11. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hindu. That particular point on the linkage between this activity and activity 6, I think it's highlighted in the draft concept note for this. I think that's key for finding opportunities for national level or local level activities. So the co-leads perhaps can take that into consideration. I believe I had Pasang next. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Yo. Thank you, other friends who have already shared on this activity 11. I just would like to, thank you, Chad, for your wonderful presentation. It was very clear for all of us to understand the finding of the study. I was very surprised to see that the funding goes to the indigenous people and local communities. The chart shows like there was a already flow of the funding. But one thing we have to really understand that when the organization or institution or any bodies allocated funding for indigenous people, how would we make sure that funding really goes to the indigenous people? Because most of the cases, the allocated even the fund that has been operationalized, maybe drop of the fund goes to the people on the ground. So we have to be really aware this fact that just only that allocated fund for the indigenous people capacity or indigenous people's welfare of the indigenous people, that doesn't mean that the funding really go meet on the it's a target. So we have to be really bear in mind when we have this kind of study, the mapping of the funding. Giving the examples of you have already given the examples of the GCF and the JEF. JEF, I have heard it, but I'm not really familiar because I have not got the opportunity to work and understand closely. However, in the GCF, I have a really bitter experience. You saw my daughters, now they are almost 5 years. When I was engaged in the GCF process as a first, I think maybe trying to make like models for indigenous peoples, I have been following so many times. Like my daughters were just 11 months when I submitted the first time the concept note of working for promotion of the indigenous people traditional and customary governance system for adaptation of the climate change to the GCF. So the process of the GCF is really nightmare, no? It's a really soothing. Now we have a indigenous people policy, we have advisory committees, we have a social environmental policy, we have a gender policy. So from outside looks, wow, it's very good, like it's very good for the indigenous people. But how many of the indigenous people organization got the access of the fund? So even like my organization in Nepal, we have been supported from many organizations around the country. We have tried to make it like a model projects working for indigenous people initiative, even like an accredited entity, UNDP, who accepted to work together for indigenous people. Still the designated authority is not aware about indigenous people, especially the Ministry of Forest and Environment, who are aware about the indigenous people issue. At least they are working on, but the case is NDA is not always the Ministry of Forest and Environment. Ministry of Finance is the NDA in Nepal. So who is really unaware about the the indigenous people issue? So it's just in such a case, my concept note that I submitted when my daughter was 11 months is still pending there. So how would we access? So therefore, we really need to work really hard that the funding opportunity directly goes to the indigenous people, not with a complicated like a kind of bending process, but direct process, so that we can assure that the chart will show that okay, the funding is there for indigenous people. Otherwise, no, this chart would be like an illusionary chart. It's just a chart for entertaining this big agency, intergovernmental or this agency, not really for indigenous people. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Pasang. Are there any other requests for the floor from the FWG members? I see Daly. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, just to follow on to what Basang has just said, is that maybe the review of opportunities in this regard, that the review and the information and accessibility of funding be complemented by some recommendations, so that we're not only looking at the larger picture of availability, but also to make some policy recommendations akin to what the Pasang has just stated about the difficulty and potential barriers, or what might be stifling access for Indigenous peoples, as well as potentially some commentary about this false dichotomy between the developing world and the developed world, and the barriers that it creates for Indigenous peoples. Just an idea, but I also recognize that this concept note has a time frame for feedback and commentary, and I've already done some track changes, but may do additional within the time frame that the co-leads have and the Secretariat have specified. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daly. And I think it's a particularly useful point to highlight about the possible additional work that can be done either within this activity in this current work plan, or maybe a future work plan continuing this activity in terms of possible recommendations. If we cannot envision recommendations coming out of the current activity in the current work plan. Because my understanding is that this activity focuses on a synthesis document and an online tool, or perhaps comments can be made in the synthesis document pertaining to some of these access challenges. But that's just my initial view on this. Are there any other FWG members that would like to take the floor? And I have been notified that in the chat, in terms of the reference to the UN General Assembly resolution from this past year on the voluntary fund, that is actually referenced in the synthesis document in paragraph 46, so it captures that. Are there any other comments from the FWG members? I do not see anyone raising a hand. Oh, sorry, I do see Rodian with a raised hand. Please go ahead, Rodian.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and yes, thank you very much for all members' contribution, and also from chat contribution. It's so helpful, and it's absolutely relevant to this very specific and critical issue we are discussing now. One of the issues we have discussed with Secretariat also to provide some kind, or to have some kind of survey among all members, because most of us also engage into the fundraising efforts at the regional, local, and sub-regional level. And I'm sure that most of us also can provide more links and resources in the area. And maybe we will continue to discuss with the Secretariat, and also to have a survey among all members, which will be, I believe, very valuable, but also with inclusion of such substantial issue like most of members just express Pasang and Andre and Deri, just also to provide a new kind of communication mechanism to contribute, because it's ongoing process from long term. So that is my also contribution proposal, and we can continue to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodian. Are there any other comments from the FWG members? I do not see any. In that case, I'd like to open it up to the wider participation list. And I believe there's a request from Terrence from UNDP. If you're online, please go ahead.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I put in the chat box some information about the review that the Jeff Small Grants Program carried out in 2018 and 2019, looking at the last 26 years of SGP support to Indigenous peoples through the UNDP implemented Jeff SGP, which was done at the request of Vicky Tali-Corpus as UN Special Rapporteur, which includes distribution of funding through direct access or through intermediaries according to different regions and thematic areas around biodiversity, climate change, land degradation, and other Jeff focal areas. Some of the results from that review will be presented in December of this year at the Jeff Council. There will be a CSO session on traditional knowledge. The Jeff Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group is currently preparing a session with the new Jeff CEO around this topic, and I think some of the people in this platform will be approached to participate in that. I would just recall as well, in response to Pasang, that UNDP worked closely with the advocacy group of Indigenous peoples around the Green Climate Fund towards the policy and organized a consultation at the COP22 in Marrakesh. So UNDP is currently looking at how to take that forwards, and Pasang noted some of the collaboration we've conducted in Nepal and some of the challenges. So yeah, basically we will share the review that was referred to, and also more information around the Jeff consultations that I just mentioned. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. And I do notice in the chat your comment, and I think you provided a link in the chat as well. And I think that link is already referenced in the synthesis document as footnote 24. But I think it would be useful to also share the independent analysis that you've identified. I do have one more request from other participants, from Jen from GCF. If you're online, please go ahead.
Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, Jennifer, okay, right? Sorry, I called you Jen, but I'm assuming it's Jennifer.
Yes, Jen. Most people call me Jen. Okay, well, thanks very much, Mr. Chair, for giving me the floor, and thanks to everyone who shared their experiences and reflections on the GCF. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Indigenous Peoples Focal Point or Specialist for the GCF. So that's first. Hi, everyone who's interested in climate finance, particularly at the GCF. I just wanted, I put in the chat, first of all, 2 paragraphs that I think might be very useful and strategic to reflect upon when you're reflecting upon your previous experiences and what you would like to see as perhaps proposed as forms of being able to access funds better. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just reflecting on Pasang's experience. Yes, I understand. I understand where that's coming from. In fact, it is very, a lot of people find it opaque, not just Indigenous peoples, but also countries. And I think if one listens to the board meetings, a lot of this is expressed. It has to do a little bit with the architecture, the volumes of funds of the fund, but that's something maybe as you move along, these are the areas to maybe do a little bit reflection and analysis on from the IP point of view. What I wanted to share was, despite all this, it was quite interesting. We did our own very rapid survey, and at a preliminary point, we found that about 34% of the projects that have been approved by a GCF actually have Indigenous peoples and local communities as a primary, or what they call a priority focused And I would say, first of all, that this is very preliminary information because I have the same sort of desire, as was discussed yesterday, to try and actually figure out what participation, when we say that Indigenous peoples are primary focus, what does that mean? Or how are they participating? And so that's something that perhaps just in a little way would be also interesting to exchange and share guidance on the different levels of participation, participation in project activities, participation in governance, and how that's structured. So when we're doing analysis like this, we're able to actually say, okay, this type of project, like the readiness activity that FILAC proposed with Nicaragua in 2018, I know that's a certain level of participation that's different from the like more normal types of participation that you see, because it's driven by FILAC, and it invited all the Indigenous representatives, and they work very, very closely with the NDA to make this all happen. So that's the second point. The third point I just also wanted to share very quickly is, in addition to the big funding proposals, and that are at quite a large scale and therefore demand a lot of safeguards, a lot of climate rationale, and a lot of very technical documents. There are also at the GCF, there is a readiness program, and through the NDAs, of course, in the country driven process, it's a way to actually access and design activities for capacity building. So it's sort of a stepping stone to be able to access larger volumes of funds, and maybe that's also something to reflect upon, how you could build partnerships to actually. And I would say probably if you were working closely enough with the NDAs, this might also include capacity building and participation at the LCIPP, for example. So that's maybe another avenue to also think about, building those partnerships with the NDAs and accredited entities who sort of channel the volumes of funds currently at the GCF. So that's it. And if you have any questions or other further information, just let me know, and I'll try and either get more information for you or try and find the colleagues in my organization who can answer that. Okay, well, thanks very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. We're a bit behind time at the moment, although I will note that the readiness program that Jennifer just mentioned is referenced in the synthesis document. So if colleagues would have comments on that particular program, you are free to submit those comments as the synthesis document is being finalized. Do I have any more requests for the floor? I do not see any. Rodion, your hand is still up. Is it a new hand or the same old hand?
No, it's the old one. Thank you.
All right. Sorry. Thank you. In that case, I think we can conclude our discussion of this particular activity. Thank you very much for this robust discussion. I think this is an important issue. At least to me, it's clear that there needs to be more consideration of this topic on funding opportunities, including in terms of discussing how to ensure proper access to funding, as well as to ensure that funding activities cover national activities, as Hindu mentioned, as well as international activities, and how that can be considered by the FWG. And I welcome and I encourage the members of the FWG and the representatives of the different financial entities that have participated so far to dialogue amongst ourselves and help inform each other's activities, including the different surveys that seem to be happening fairly regularly about these funding opportunities. So with that, I would like to pass it over to the Secretariat for a bit of an explanation of the second part of today's meeting, especially the breakout groups and how those will proceed. Please go ahead, Secretary.
Yeah, thank you, Yo. So participants and members, you can see that on the schedule after the 20-minute break, there will be 2 parallel breakout groups. So we ask everybody that's in the meeting now to not leave the meeting during the break, but leave yourself in this meeting room, because we do need to use those 20 minutes to move everybody into separate breakout group rooms. So please stay connected during the break. The co-chairs, Yo and Andrea, will each co-chair one of those. They're on the same topic. And the point of the breakout groups is to follow the model that we usually have when we meet in person, which is to have breakout groups so that more contributors can also raise their voice and take the floor. So these breakout groups will be on the topic of enhancing the coherence of the actions of the LCIPP. And that's specific in today's breakout group, the coherence of relevant processes and bodies underneath the convention. Tomorrow in the breakout groups, the topic will be enhancing coherence, but outside of the convention with other UN bodies, etc. So today the focus was on bodies and processes under the convention, and both breakout groups will have the same topic, just to give more people a chance to speak up and have their say. In those breakout groups, contributors are encouraged to give their inputs, raise their voice, have their say. The co-chairs are going to be nominating rapporteurs, and the rapporteurs will then come back to this room at the end of the day for about 20 minutes or half an hour to feed back into the full plenary on what was mainly discussed in those groups. Thank you, Yo. Oh, I'm sorry, I need to add the interpretation. One of the rooms will have French interpretation and one of the rooms will have Spanish interpretation. Yesterday, we announced that if anybody needed to be in a specific room for that purpose, then they should let us know. So we've taken that into account. We've tried our best to put people in the right rooms. If you get into a room and there's not the interpretation that you need, you can move yourself to the other room. There is a way to do that. So during the break, we'll be moving everybody to the rooms. So like I said, please do leave yourself connected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. And yes, let's proceed in that manner. Have a good discussion, everyone. Oh, sorry, I see Andrea. Please go ahead.
Thank you. And I know this topic and theme was decided by the Secretariat together with our previous co-chairs. I did get a couple questions from my region about what this co-theme means and addresses, and maybe you could give a couple of examples just so we don't have to take time explaining that in the breakouts. Thank you.
Sure. So as you know, the COP mandated that coherence be enhanced under the platform, under the convention as well as outside. This comes from a COP mandate, so it's a standing item for the FWG to consider. For today's item, I'll just share my screen quickly. Just give me a moment, and I'll show you some of the relevant bodies and processes under the convention that can be discussed if you like. Let me just share my screen.
Imagine coherence under a UN entity.
Sorry, I'm having some technical issues with sharing my screen today. I've just got a new computer. I can just read them out instead. I think that might be easier. Sorry about that. So basically, under the convention, for instance, we have 17 constituted bodies. So there's something called a constituted body, which is a non-negotiating body, more technical expert body that's set up on a particular topic. So of the 17, some examples which you're very familiar with would be the Adaptation Committee. The Facilitative Working Group, of course, is one of the newest ones. The Technology Executive Committee, the Standing Committee on Finance, that's very relevant to Activity 11, of course. The WIM XCOM, that's the one that deals with loss and damage. Then there's the Katowice Committee on Experts on the Implementation of the Impact of Response Measures, the KCI, that was established in Katowice, and it's one of the newest ones, along with the FWG. There's others that we regularly work with, such as the CGE, the Consultative Group of Experts, which does a lot of training. So there's obviously a link there, or the PCCB, which deals with capacity building. So those are just some examples. There are 17 of these bodies, of which the FWG is one. And any of these bodies can be discussed in the upcoming breakout group. We can also share this list. I'll ask Marcelo and Chad to share their screens in the breakout room so that you have this full list. But there's also other processes, under the convention where coherence can be enhanced. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll proceed in that manner. I note that in the schedule, in the agenda, we're supposed to have a break until 40 past the hour. But since we're starting a little bit late, perhaps we can begin the breakout groups at 45 past the hour. Give you an extra 5 minutes maybe. But please, as they said, please remain online as we transition you to the breakout groups. Thank you.
Tiffany, please let. Oh,
Pardon me,
sorry.
Andrea, did you?
Are we ready to start?
Yes, we're just going to get moved into the breakout groups and then we can start.
Oh, okay. All right.
Right now we're
Thank you
still
very
in the
much.
plenary. Thanks.
Okay. Please. Hello, everyone. The Secretariat will let me know when we can resume the plenary. Is everyone back?
Everyone's here, Andrea.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to chair this last session, which is just 20 minutes till the end of our meeting, in which we're going to have report from our 2 rapporteurs for the breakout session. My group had a very fruitful discussion, and we did better when we introduced the word collaboration rather than coherence, because coherence is kind of a concept and collaboration is actually activities. So we did better when we focused on that. So I'm not sure which of the rapporteurs want to present first. Our rapporteur was Thomas Cameron from Government of Canada. I'm not sure who the other rapporteur was.
Jane is the other rapporteur, Andrea.
Okay, all right. So whichever of you wants to go first, please take the floor.
I'll go ahead and go first. We had a really insightful and thought-provoking discussion in our breakout group. And we started with some questions or just some notes that the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform is not the only space where we discuss Indigenous peoples and Indigenous issues. We also have the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, and that the UN and the work with Indigenous peoples should be more widespread than just the FWG under the LCIPP platform. And he made the recommendation that we need some greater coherence between the FWG and the Indigenous Caucus, and that would be very advantageous to us as a strategy to increase that. And we had others note that we need to ensure that the Indigenous Caucus maintains a voice outside of the FWG, that there should be some coherence and collaboration between the two, but there should be a retained autonomy to some extent as well between the two groups. And that the Indigenous Caucus itself does not always work exactly in line with the FWG, and that they develop things outside of the work within this platform. We had a question from the group to ask what has occurred thus far in terms of Indigenous engagement between other parties and UN bodies, and asked to kind of paint a picture of what that's been like. And so we had Hindu share primarily what that engagement has been like. That in our meetings, we have met with adaptation committees, gender committees. We have meetings like this planned for our capacity building. And she made a really important note that we need stronger participation from the parties and UN bodies in our meetings and groups, and that it cannot just be Indigenous peoples having conversations with each other. We can't just be creating this sort of, as Yo said, a one-sided echo chamber where we're having the same discussions with just ourselves, bringing up the same issues that we care about, but not hearing from the parties themselves about how we can get more engaged in their work. And that there's a need to build trust with government and decision makers so that we can have more insight and input onto policy building itself, which is a really important statement to make clear that this is an attempt at creating a new inclusive space, and that we're not trying to just have discussions with ourselves as Indigenous peoples, but actually make progress towards changing policy. We had some discussion as well on the Indigenous Caucus and being interested in suggesting an intersessional informal meeting or dialogue to discuss the issues, a variety of issues, including governance and what the relationship between the FWG and caucus looks like and can become as we move forward. There's some discussion on the complexities of governance and the relationship between the FWG and the caucus, determining important issues like the issues we have with local communities and other things, Article 6. There are some concerns between the relationship of the FWG and Indigenous Caucus. We further welcomed the conversation or an informal dialogue between the two. The Indigenous caucus members, some noted that it can be difficult for them to get their messages across to other UN bodies and parties without support from the FWG. And so this is something that we might want to look at more closely. There's just a strong need to ensure that coherence. We had some people from different parties and UNs invite us to a variety of virtual meetings or events that are going to be happening. I'm assuming the Secretariat will share those opportunities if needed. We had some Laura Wieland from ECOS share more a little bit on ACE and their ability to be used as a tool for engaging more into climate change policy and spaces. And let's see. And we had others echo Hindu's point that it's very important to get policy and decision makers and those who are participating in negotiations involved with us and our space. We won't be able to really make that impact without that engagement. And we had some ask, how can we as the parties do better? How can we engage more on key discussions and issues and decision makings? And then, yes, we further stressed the importance of Article 6 and the importance to engage with different parties on that issue. Some noted that many in the research community are looking to partner with Indigenous peoples more thoroughly, specifically on adaptation strategies, and that there's much opportunity for us to get more involved in these spaces as well. And then we ended with another reiteration of the importance to maybe suggest an intersessional dialogue with the Indigenous Caucus and FWG, with a note that the FWG is not meant to be the voice of Indigenous peoples entirely. It's a way to amplify Indigenous work being done, but it is not meant to encapsulate the integrity of Indigenous peoples' voices as a whole, and that there should be continued collaboration and coherence between those. But I'll let anybody else from our breakout add more if I missed anything or didn't give focus to anything else that was important.
Jane, we have less than 10 minutes left. So what I would like to do is have the second group report, and we're supposed to end on the hour, but let's see if we have time for more discussion after that. Unless there's any burning issues, I would like to give the second group a chance to report back, and then if there's time, open it up for questions and contributions. Thank you. Thomas?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. So yeah, we had a great discussion as well. It kind of began with Chad giving an overview of a couple of the invitations that the FWG had received. So Nairobi Work Program, the WIM, and Least Developed Countries Expert Group, amongst others. I think one of the key kicking off points that we discussed was essentially how to engage with the Nairobi Work Program, and especially kind of the history of how Indigenous knowledge has kind of entered into UNFCCC discussions, and that Nairobi Work Program and their efforts being really the first entry point for Indigenous knowledge under the UNFCCC, and kind of the key point there being that the FWG should look at other ways that they can generate momentum on kind of Indigenous issues and perspectives that necessarily don't have to go through the SUFSTA, and the Nairobi Work Program was pointed to as an example of that. We then heard about the importance of not just collaboration at the international level, but also at the local and national level. And I think one of the key concerns kind of offered there was that for a number of parties, they're already underway in planning their updated NDCs and their first or second iterations of national adaptation plans, and whether they're engaging with Indigenous peoples and local communities is a concern, and how to kind of both promote collaboration at the international level, but also make sure those key entry points into the national kind of policies aren't missed. We also heard about the need for continuous education about the work of the other constituted bodies, how they work, what their key topics are, maybe addressing that through a list of focal points that FWG members can use to engage with other constituted bodies. But overall, just a general need to increase the capacity to to have that broader picture of other of the UNFCCC's work as a whole. We also heard about the need to. We also discussed Article 6, like the other group, particularly as it relates to Articles 6.8 and 6.9 in terms of non-market-based approaches. And while the group recognized that the FWG is not a negotiating body, finding ways to input views and certainly participate in those non-market-based approaches once they're finalized would be a key point of interest. We also talked about some of the key thematic work of other constituted bodies, for example, in the coastal and marine area on adaptation, and kind of pointed to how these cross-cutting thematic areas are areas where Indigenous peoples hold knowledge and can contribute, and trying to find the entry points to contribute to that work. We also talked about kind of acting on these invitations in terms of the FWG maybe doing focus sessions with specific bodies to give input, or looking at structures like the WIM task force where constituted bodies representatives can participate, and that would be a way to get Indigenous peoples or Indigenous FWG members onto different constituted bodies within the UNFCCC. And then yeah, I think we also had a more fulsome discussion around rights safeguards, especially in Articles 4.4, 4.2, and the ongoing discussions on Article 6 under the Paris Agreement. And we kind of concluded with just a reiteration of the importance and it being a good practice for those meetings with other constituted bodies in the substep between the FWG, just to hear what they're working on and to exchange views. And I'm sure I missed anything, but I'll stop there and let anyone else add.
Thank you. I know we're just about out of time. I will just add a couple of points is that we did began to have input from other UN bodies, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, UNESCO, and others. And I reminded them that that discussion will take place in breakouts tomorrow. And I hope that the richness of these discussions, I noticed the first group put their notes in the chat, and I want to invite Thomas to also do that. That might be the best way for members and participants to add their comments if anything was left out. Because we have 3 minutes to when we're supposed to end this meeting. And I do want to make sure that the Secretariat, I saw a hand from the Secretariat, would any, briefly, 30 seconds, would any of the members of the Facilitating Working Group like to add or make comments along those lines? I want to thank both working groups and also my co-chair, Yo, for what was a very fruitful discussion, and some things look like they were distinct. We talked about different things, but they're very complementary. And I think once they get put together, we'll have a good list of ways to move forward on this collaborative approach with the other constituted bodies, as well as the Indigenous caucus in this process at the UNFCCC. Would the Secretariat like to add any housekeeping or guidance notes? I'm assuming that the chairs and co-chairs will be meeting with you afterwards to talk about organization for our final session tomorrow. Tiffany, or did anyone want to add something from the Secretariat?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Yes, so the co-chairs and vice co-chairs can just stay in the room, and we'll move you to a separate room for a briefing. But for tomorrow morning, some housekeeping announcements for all participants is there will be another breakout group when we start tomorrow morning, but everyone will start in the plenary. So everyone comes here to the normal meeting, and then again, we'll send everyone to the groups. And the topic for tomorrow is, again, enhancing the coherence of the actions of the LCIPP. So collaboration under the LCIPP, and this time relevant bodies external to the convention. So some of those were already mentioned today, but they can be raised again tomorrow. And participants are welcome to come prepared with a couple of bullets, especially if you have upcoming events that are very interesting for Indigenous peoples or local communities or relevant to the LCIPP. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you. And there is a note in the chat regarding the challenge for non-English speakers to participate and intervene. They're able to listen, but not necessarily say anything. And I just want to say to Zulema that we have been, que hemos estado traduciendo si tienes una intervención en español, ¿verdad? Uno de nosotros podamos traducir para ti si quiere intervenir. I'm just saying, telling her if she wants to make a statement, we have members of the Facilitative Working Group that can do a translation, and we did that yesterday. Tiffany?
The interpreters are translating as well. If people did speak in Spanish, they translated into English or French.
Oh, great. Maybe you can type that on in Spanish on the chat so people can know how to make a statement if they want to in non-English, at least in French or Spanish. Thank you. Are there any final comments from the Facilitative Working Group members? Anything you'd like to share as we close? Okay. Thomas, please type your notes into the chat from our session. I want to thank everybody again for a very interesting and fruitful day of discussion and input. And we'll look forward to seeing you back here. For me, in the morning, 7 a.m. the meeting starts. But whenever your time zone is, we look forward to seeing you. And thank you again to the interpreters, as well as, of course, to our fantastic secretariat and